Joining us right now is State Representative Vikki Goodwin, who's running for the Democratic nomination for Lieutenant Governor. Representative Goodwin, good to have you join the show. How are you doing?
I'm great. Thank you for having me.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you for coming on. Why run for Lieutenant Governor?
Well, after 30 years of Republican leadership, I believe it's time for change. Our current leadership is not helping our public education system. They haven't fixed our broken healthcare system. Affordability is a huge issue, and water in the state of Texas is also a really huge issue. Our current leadership is not paying attention to the critical issues of the day, and so that's why I'm running for lieutenant governor.
And let's talk about the March 3rd primary, because the reason we're talking right now is because you were not able to secure 50%. You and your challenger in this runoff, Marcos Velez, did not get that 50% majority. What are you doing now to appeal to voters who may not have sided with you in March? And I'll remind our viewers, you garnered about 48% of the vote, while Mr. Velez came in second with about 32%.
Yeah, really, it is educating voters on the position, how incredibly important the lieutenant governor position is, connecting the dots to how the lieutenant governor has an impact on their daily lives, and making sure that I am traveling around the state and building that name recognition. Because while so many new voters came out to vote in this March primary, there were lots of young voters, lots of new voters who just don't typically vote in a primary election. I'm not sure they did their research all the way down the ballot. So they knew whether they were going to vote for James Tellerico or Jasmine Crockett, but I don't think they all researched the lieutenant governor race. And I let them know that I am the experienced candidate. I've been serving in the Texas legislature for 4 terms now, 8 years, and I've built relationships, but I've also passed legislation. It's incredibly hard to pass legislation in the Texas legislature. And so knowing the process and knowing the people is incredibly important to be able to be effective as lieutenant governor on day one.
If you could tell voters about one bill you've wrote that you feel, or one vote you've taken that you feel defines who you are, what would you tell them?
It's hard to condense it down to one, but I will say that I have always supported our public schools, and that's been one of my main focuses. In my first session, I tried to amend the school funding bill at that point in time with a way to keep it increasing year after year to keep up with inflation, because that's what we've seen since 2019. Our school funding formula has not kept up with inflation, and all across the state, our school districts are running into deficit budgets, having to close schools. Some of them are going to 4-day school weeks and increasing class sizes. So if we had simply approved that amendment to increase the basic allotment regularly, as opposed to waiting on us as legislators to increase it, we would be in much better shape. Our school districts would be.
Would you seek to increase the basic allotment if you're elected lieutenant governor, and if so, to what amount?
Yes, so I would increase it to $7,500 per student. Right now, it's just over 6,000. That would catch us up to inflation, at least as of 2025. It would have caught us up to inflation from 2019. And so that would certainly help a lot. What we did is we added $55 to the basic allotment in 2025, and that's really nothing. Our school districts are still struggling. So I would raise it to catch us up to inflation.
If I heard you correctly, you said you'd raise it to $7,500. How do you go about paying for that?
Well, in this last session, I'm on the appropriations committee now. We underspent what we could have by $4 billion. But beyond that, we also gave $1 billion to private schools. I'm opposed to sending our public tax dollars to private schools. So I would not fund any more of that. I would make sure that we're spending the money that we have available to us, and we may have to move some things around in the budget.
Well, did you just to give our viewers an idea, did you underspend or just put more money in the surplus?
Well, essentially, we could have put more, 4 billion additional dollars into our budget, and we chose not to. So we underspent. Well, underallocated.
And you mentioned education there. If you had to tell voters what your biggest priorities would be if you're elected lieutenant governor, what would you tell them?
So my biggest priorities are public education, K through 12, and higher ed. These days, our higher education institutions are under attack from our current leaders. Second is fix our broken healthcare system. We have the highest rate of uninsured and we have the highest rate of maternal mortality. Those are things that we can fix by putting more emphasis on preventive care. My third priority is affordability, particularly housing affordability. I want young people in particular to believe that they can one day buy a home of their own if that's what they want. And then finally, putting an emphasis on planning for our future water and energy needs here in the state of Texas.
We're going to get to a lot of that. Let's talk about housing first and foremost. It's my understanding you want to streamline local permitting processes and reduce unnecessary regulations. What regulations are you talking about, and how will you go about reducing them?
Well, actually, the legislature did try to streamline the permitting process, and I don't think we've been entirely successful with that. But to be honest, a couple of the ideas that I had this last session, one was called the Fair Rent Incentive Act to put downward pressure on rent prices so that renters could save up and one day buy a home. The other was to expand an already existing program here in Texas called Texas Homes for Heroes that provides down payment assistance and low interest rate loans for our first responders and our teachers. I tried to expand that program by expanding the income guidelines. Unfortunately, wasn't able to get that passed. Right now, we serve 10,000 people through that program. It wouldn't cost the state anything because it is a loan program. It would just allow more people to have access to another loan option, which would allow more people to buy homes. The other thing is, we've heard that our housing workforce, the people who build our homes, are being deported, detained, and oftentimes afraid to show up to work. So we've seen a reduction in our workforce, and that has caused a slowdown in our building industry. We need to make sure that our workforce feels safe coming to work.
Now, as Lieutenant Governor, it's my understanding you couldn't directly introduce legislation. You could make priorities, but you couldn't directly introduce legislation. So, how would you go about putting, initiatives like this new housing program so that they do become law?
I mean, there are plenty of senators and representatives who can file the legislation. I will simply say this is what my priorities are, and I'll listen to the senators. They have some excellent bills that haven't been able to be passed. I know my colleagues in the House have often tried to do things like expand Medicaid to make our election laws better, to improve a lot of our systems in the state. So there's legislation out there that just has never been able to pass under the current Lieutenant Governor Dan Patrick.
What would be your approach to working with individuals who may disagree with your policy stances, whether it be in the Senate, the House, or even the governor's office?
I find that I can always find some common ground with just about everybody. In fact, one of the bills that I passed around mental health a couple of years ago was working with Senator, gosh, now Bob Hall, sorry, from North Texas. And we don't agree on a lot of things, but we were able to come to an agreement on the fact that we need more mental health services. And so together we were able to expand this one particular type of therapy. And I always find common ground by having these conversations with my colleagues, understanding what the needs are in their communities, and making sure that we find a way to improve the lives of Texans. Because I know at the end of the day, that's what every member, senator, and representative, that's their interest, is to serve the people in their communities.
You mentioned healthcare a bit earlier in this interview. I want to ask you about rural healthcare in particular. What are the biggest challenges you see in rural parts of the state, and what will you do, if elected, to solve them in terms of healthcare?
Well, we know because we have not expanded Medicaid and because a lot of people are uninsured, a lot of rural hospitals have closed down. And I hear all the time from people who say they have to drive an hour or 2 hours to get to the doctor. We're also seeing, a decrease in the number of OB-GYN doctors. And so that's really horrible for a woman who is about to give birth to have to drive a long distance to do so. So I really want to make sure that we are making Texas a state where young residents want to come and then stay here and become doctors. We need to make sure that we're incentivizing that. And so improving the policies, whether it's expanding Medicaid, or I want to think about a Texas plan that makes sure that all people have the ability to go see a doctor early on. Preventive care is less expensive and the outcomes are better. And that's what's really important, is making sure people have the ability to get to the doctor for their preventive care.
Yeah, it's my understanding you've called for Medicaid expansion that makes sense. What does that exactly mean?
Well, so I am for Medicaid expansion, but I've also heard from doctors who say that the amount they're reimbursed doesn't cover the cost of care, that sometimes it takes many months to get reimbursed, and sometimes the money is clawed back. So for me, that is a problematic system. We should come up with a Texas plan that makes sure that we are covering those people who don't have health insurance from their employer, that they have a doctor that they can go see. Again, preventive care, making sure we're expanding programs that are currently working. And so, yes, I am for expanding Medicaid if we can make that work. But I also think we might need to supplement it with a Texas plan that is covering those people who aren't otherwise covered and making sure they can go see a doctor early on. You know, what's happening now is people are ending up in the emergency room. And then that oftentimes falls on the counties to pay for that indigent care. And it's more expensive and the outcomes are worse. So why aren't we making sure people can go early on, get their health care taken care of when it's less expensive and the outcomes are better?
Would you try and find a way to make it so the state would pay for that cost the county already incurs, or is that's not something you want to go towards?
Potentially, I think we should have better partnerships with our cities and our counties. We've seen over the years how the state has created funds for different things, and then they make it very difficult for the cities and counties to access that money. Healthcare, I'm not sure if that's the case, but for example, the Flood Infrastructure Fund we created, and then in the case of Kerr County, they were trying to set up a flood warning system. The state said, okay, we'll pay 10%. You have to cover the other 90%. And they said they didn't have the funds for that. How about a 50-50 partnership and just making sure that the state is really a good collaborative partner with our cities and counties?
Data centers. Your thoughts on their development, whether they should be built in Texas or not?
So, we're seeing a proliferation of data centers right now, which is really concerning people all over the state. Oftentimes, we're seeing multiple data centers trying to come into one city or one county, and the residents are starting to have some concerns about that, whether it's water usage, energy usage, the noise from them, et cetera. So, I think the state should maybe put a pause and do some study to understand. In fact, I think the legislature is currently looking at this. How many do we need? Where do we need them? What regulations should we have around them? In my opinion, we should not incentivize them. We gave $1 billion worth of incentives to data centers in 2025, and that's going to increase. I think the estimates are for another $3 billion worth of sales tax abatements in the coming 2 years. So, why are we doing that? I think we need to take a step back, take a look at what we're doing. Maybe we don't need to incentivize them. Maybe we need to have better regulations, make sure that they're bringing the infrastructure needed for water and energy as opposed to incurring those costs and having homeowners have to pay for it.
So, if you are elected lieutenant governor, would you seek to implement a pause on data center development?
I would.
Okay.
I would.
And let me ask you, how do you view the balance between what some see as an economic gain in building data centers and concern that their development would harm Texans?
So, I heard from a constituent recently that there are better ways to do this, that we don't need all of these huge data centers that are being built right now. And so, again, I think it requires us to take a step back, look into what are some other options. Yes, AI can be beneficial, but AI can also take jobs. So I think a lot more research needs to be done to make sure that any AI is beneficial, and we have some regulations, some guardrails to make sure. We did pass a bill in the legislature around AI, trying to make it safe, particularly for instances where it might be used for minors or against minors for bullying. And we found that just after that law was passed, there was an incident where somebody used AI and bullied some other students. And so we need to make sure that we've got enforcement mechanisms as well as the laws to make it safe.
If you end up winning this runoff, you will face incumbent Lieutenant Governor Dan Patrick in the general election. What can voters expect in terms of a change if you were to win from his tenure to yours?
Oh, it would be an incredible change should I beat Dan Patrick in November. I think people would be very happy to see some change in just how the Senate is run. Right now, he runs it with an iron fist. And what I mean by that is it's really his way or the highway. He doesn't give a lot of leeway for the senators to have dissent. In fact, one of the senators he called on and said, "This is not a debatable motion." Any motion is debatable, but he tries to clamp down on dissent in the Senate. So, whereas I believe that we need to hear all voices, we need to hear all perspectives, and we need to make sure that we are serving the people of Texas and not large dollar donors. So, it will be a huge difference. The priorities will be different. The way that we serve, who is in chairman positions in the Senate, will be different. And I look forward to that day.
Would you happen to have a specific example of when you feel Lieutenant Governor Patrick clamped down on dissent?
Well, like I said, the senator who was told that it wasn't a debatable motion, I will also say there was an example when someone in the gallery, in the audience, didn't stand up for the prayer. And he said that he would have them escorted out the next time if they didn't stand up for the prayer. But, I believe in religious freedom. If someone does not believe in the prayer being offered, that I think it's their right to sit down. And they weren't being disruptive, they simply weren't standing for the prayer. So, things like that. I think also I've noticed in the Senate that they do a roll call. They don't go through all the names. And I asked my senator about that. She said, well, because Dan Patrick knows how every senator is going to vote on every bill ahead of time. And that I think is wrong because there should be debate happening on the Senate floor. There should be members potentially changing their mind if they hear something that sways them. But in the current Senate, the way it's structured, Dan Patrick tells the senators how to vote. He uses leverage like, oh, you've got a project in your district that you want. Well, if you don't vote for my bill, you're not going to get that project. And so that's not the way the Senate should be run.
Talk to me a little bit. Is that different at all in the Texas House? Because from what I recall, you hear the bell ringing, the votes are coming. They don't always read all the names, and then they bang the gavel. Vote is yay, nay. Is that different in the Senate? Because I don't recall that being the
It,
case.
well, in the House, we have the lights, so we can see how every member has voted, and they don't go through a verbal roll call. Whereas in the Senate, they do go through the verbal roll call. They've turned in their pieces of paper or whatever and let the lieutenant governor know ahead of time how they're voting. But again, I think there's just less opportunity to debate and change your mind because there's a lot of pressure from the current lieutenant governor to vote a certain way.
I know you're running to be president of the Senate, but if you could have a roll call vote in the House mandated, would you want that?
I mean, I think the way it works in the House works. Having everyone push a button to show their vote, we can see. There's been some debate about maybe it would be better if we didn't see how all the members were voting because sometimes that does cause a change. But the system has worked, and I don't think it's broken, so I don't see a need to fix it.
If you do not end up winning in this runoff, do you plan on endorsing in the lieutenant governor contest? And if so, who?
Sure. I if I don't win the runoff, then that means that Marcus Velez would win, and I am absolutely going to support and endorse the Democrat who is running against Dan Patrick.
So you would endorse Mr. Velez.
I would, should he win the runoff. Yes.
The runoff is coming up on May 26th. Is there anything I did not ask you, Representative Goodwin, that you would like to add?
I think you covered a lot of ground there. I'm just very excited for this race. I think 2026 shows a great opportunity for us to bring some change. So remember, we need a good win for Texas.
Democratic candidate for Texas Lieutenant Governor and current representative in the Texas House, Representative Vikki Goodwin. We appreciate you coming on the program.
Thank you so much.